And hello, this is Nancy Bergman, and this is another edition of History Files.
And I'm Mary C. Anderson. So, Miss Nancy, what are we going to talk about today?
We are going to talk about part 3 of World War I, which is Mary's favorite subject. But, you know, she is so good to come in here today and help me with this, because otherwise I know what she'd rather be doing would be out skipping through the pastures looking for dung beetles, right?
Oh, definitely, definitely. Dung beetles are one of our favorite things to talk about. And of course, with the rain that we've got going the last few weeks, we're hopefully going to have good soil moisture going into winter.
That's wonderful, isn't it? So anyway, she's so nice, but she just accused me of bleaching my hair. And
yes.
That is not true.
Yes,
Believe
I
me.
suspect that Miss Nancy spends thousands of dollars doing the
right look. Yeah,
the platinum
right,
look.
Right, well,
but
that's
it's beautiful.
Not the case.
It's a beautiful
that's
color.
Not the case. Well, thank you. I mean, our hairstylists were just here, and they worked so hard on us.
I know.
So what you see now is absolute perfection, right?
Definitely, definitely.
Well, what we're going to talk about is, as a quick summary, 100 years ago, in 1918, is when the United States was involved in what now is known as World War I, although up until World War II, it was really known as the Great War.
Yes.
And not because it was wonderful and great, it was because it was huge war. And I guess, until I really started studying this subject, I had thought it was mainly, you know, France and Britain and Germany going at it, and then the United States came in briefly. But no, I mean, it involved a lot of countries.
What are some of the other countries that were involved in the Great War?
Well, on the German side, there was what was known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that at that time took in Austria and Hungary and Poland. I don't think, you know, if you looked at a map back then, there really wasn't a Poland. It was just part of this huge empire. Italy was in this war. There were countries in Africa, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, and Russia. I mean, it was a huge war, and it really was global. And by the time it was done, so many soldiers, combatants, and civilians had been killed or died from direct cause of the war, that it reduced the entire population of the globe by a quarter.
Really?
Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
That is.
That's a lot of people to not be around anymore.
Almost like the Black Plague.
Yes. Yeah, it was terrible. It was carnage. It was disease. The United States came in 1917, and at that time the United States had a really small army. It was about 100,000, and that meant they had to go from like this pretty small army to, they wanted to have an army of a couple million. So they really had to ramp things up in a short time.
And how did they do that, Nancy?
Well, they started drafting people, and then they built camps all around the United States so they could, you know, the draftees could come in and have training. And near the end of the war, the training period got really truncated. There was a poor guy from, I think, up by Eliva by the name of Clavested, and it was 4 months from the time that he was drafted and was sent to a training camp until he was killed on a battlefield in France. 4 months.
That's not a lot of time.
That's not a lot of time for training or anything, considering it took him at least 2 weeks to get over to France on a boat.
To the front.
From the United States, yeah. So there were a lot of people there that had minimal training. And it was really sad, really.
And so were we able to ramp up to that
The amazing
1 to 2 million?
The amazing thing was that they did. And the United States really, I think they learned a whole lot about logistics and moving things, and they just rose to the task. And it was incredible because actually Britain and France, they thought, okay, here comes all the Americans with all these, you know, guys, and they just wanted stuck into their various armies as replacements. But General Pershing and President Wilson said, no way, we're fighting as an American army. You know, this army is not going to be
blended,
piecemealed all over
Yeah.
and everything. So, and really it was in 1918, this summer was when the United States got in and really started, you know, fighting as an American force.
And now, Nancy, this is all hand-to-hand combat. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not like today where, I mean, there was air assault, but it was drastically different than
Yeah.
the computer-modeled smart bomb where we can take it and put it
I'm
exactly
afraid it wasn't like
at the
that, no.
X on the screen.
Right, it was a lot of infantry, although they say it was really a war of artillery. It's where the artillery really came in there, and they said that most of the casualties and deaths were caused by artillery, because when these shells would hit, there would be like little pieces of metal
Fragments.
all over the place, all over. And if you got hit with even a small one, that was pretty serious. You know, it was a big chunk of hot metal. So
Yes.
that killed a lot of people. So I thought what we would do today is we would just talk about some things that the American soldiers, especially the guys in the infantry, that they had to put up with. So what we will start with today is, what do you know about cooties?
Cooties, when I was much younger, you know, just a few weeks back,
Yeah,
if
yesterday.
if you were on the outs with your social circle when you were young and in school, and maybe that junior high category, you might have cooties, which were tiny little itchy bugs,
Lice.
lice.
Right. They had a terrible problem with lice. So, but let's consider, you've got a lot of men who maybe don't get a chance to have a bath or a shower for 3 months at a time.
Well, traditionally in that time period, people didn't shower twice a day.
Oh, no, no, no. And especially when the infantry were up at the front, they didn't have shower facilities. They were pretty much wearing the same thing day after day. They were responsible for washing their own clothes, and so I suppose there were guys that did a lot, but it wasn't like they could go to a laundromat. They had to find a stream or something to wash them in.
And then how would you dry your clothes in the middle of a war zone?
Right. Well, it must be difficult. Plus, that was a very rainy summer and fall. They said it just rained all the time. So it must have been really hard. And what they tried to do was they had these things called delousing stations. And soldiers would come in, I suppose like a regiment at a time or whatever, and they'd give them their clothes, their uniforms, and they'd put them in these big vats where they would steam them like for about an hour.
Okay.
And supposedly that was supposed to kill the lice. Well, it killed the ones that were alive and running around, but it didn't kill the eggs, which got in the seams. So, like maybe, you know, they put on their deloused uniform, and not too long afterwards they were right back to where they started with. But that just seems like every account I've read, especially diaries, that's what they had. Everybody had lice, and it was really...
And they didn't have the modern controls
No.
like we have today.
You get a bunch of guys together. I mean, that could happen these days too. I mean, people still get lice, but they had this huge problem with lice and being deloused. And just the thought of that just kind of gives me the willies. But I guess they just had to learn to
Itch and live with it.
live with it. Yeah, but that must have been misery. They said especially at night when they were trying to sleep, they would, you know.
Feel them crawling around?
Oh, yeah.
Itchy bugs. I
Yeah,
can't do bugs very well.
No, I know. And another thing that they had to put up with, because this was when they got up to the front where the battles were rats.
That I could see.
Yes, lots of rats, because there was a lot of dead things around. There were a lot of dead horses and mules
And cows
and people.
and people
Yeah.
and leftover waste product.
Well, yeah, they
from-
didn't have porta potties.
They didn't have porta potties, nor did they have proper disposal of excess food goods, although there probably wasn't a lot.
No.
But those sea ration containers had, what did they do with those? that's a perfect place for critters to come in.
Yeah.
And
Every picture that I've seen of infantry at the front, it's just trash all over. There's just trash.
And garbage brings little critters in.
Brings in rats.
To eat.
And they said again, this was at night when they were trying to sleep. They would, the rats would come out and they'd feel them. They'd get bit by rats, or they'd feel them crawling over them. It was not nice.
No, not at all.
No. So they really had to put up with some pretty nasty stuff.
Now, most of their sleeping quarters, were those tents? Were those structures? I'm sure there were times when they slept in foxholes.
Well, I guess it was just kind of a matter of what they could find, what was available. When they came into these French villages, a lot of these villages had already been, really blasted to half rubble. But they would put them up in barns. They would put them up in buildings where nobody was anymore. And every infantryman had like half of a tent. A big flap, and then if you had a buddy, you could put the two halves together and have a tent. But it wasn't exactly, fancy accommodations.
It wasn't the Ritz.
No, it wasn't. And they were sleeping on the ground a lot, and it was wet, it was rainy. I just can't imagine anything more miserable than that.
But that's almost a perfect environment for vermin and, and lice.
And rats.
And rats.
And another animal that was a little more pleasant and helpful were carrier pigeons. Do you know anything about carrier pigeons?
I know that they went extinct in Wisconsin.
Oh, that was...
No, that was a passenger.
That was a passenger
pigeon.
Right.
Let's talk about carrier pigeons.
Not that I know a whole lot about carrier pigeons, but at that time they had was it a carrier pigeon corps? Was men that were especially trained in using carrier pigeons. They would go into battle sometimes with these little cages on their back that had carrier pigeons in them, because that was a way of communication.
Yeah, there was no texting,
no cell phone,
or phone,
no texting.
No fast communication, no tweeting.
Nope.
In World War I, there was no tweeting.
Absolutely not. And so if it really got bad and you had to send a message back, you would take one of these carrier pigeons and you'd put the message in you run it around one of their little legs and send it off, and it would fly back. Now, this is what I don't know, is, carrier pigeons fly back to their home.
Yes.
How long did they have to be in a spot before they recognized it as their home?
Well, it would be interesting to find that out, because as the front would move,
right,
the command centers moved as well.
Right. So it wasn't like these pigeons. They had,
they didn't have Google Maps.
No, they didn't. So they used these carrier pigeons, and there's pictures of guys, going to the front, and what does he have on his back? It looks like a little, chicken coop, and it's actually a cage with carrier pigeons in it.
Now, is it true that as a defense against the carrier pigeons, that there was a lot of falconry?
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard that, but I mean, the pigeons were used by both sides, the Germans as well as the Allies. And they knew, when you saw a pigeon fluttering by and there was a battle, you should shoot it if possible. And there's one pigeon from World War I that is stuffed in the Smithsonian Museum out in Washington, D.C., called Cherami. And Cherami is probably one of the most famous carrier pigeons, because it was right about now, it was early October 1918, this battalion, they were called the Lost Battalion. It wasn't like they were lost, but they got surrounded. And they were surrounded by the Germans, and they had for it was almost 5 days, they had no food or water. They didn't have any medical supplies. They were constantly being attacked by the Germans, and they managed to hold them off. But it got pretty desperate, and near the end, the American artillery didn't have the range of the Germans, and so they were lobbing artillery onto these poor guys that were already in a desperate situation. And they had to get a message back, and so they were down to 2 carrier pigeons, and I'm surprised they didn't eat them, really.
Right, but they wouldn't go very far.
There's not much to eat on that little carrier pigeon anyway.
Snack food.
So they put the message on this pigeon and hoped it would go back and tell them that they had to stop this artillery because they were hitting their own men. Well, they let the pigeon go, and it fluttered up to the top of the tree, and it just kind of sat there. And so the poor guy that was like the pigeon man had to climb up the tree and shake the branch to get the pigeon moving, you know.
I suppose he was afraid to fly out and
I
have
would
the artillery.
be.
I wouldn't want to take flight in the middle of a war zone.
Either. So this pigeon, Jeremy, finally got it going, and it flew off, and they just hoped, well, I hope that, you know. And it turned out the pigeon did make it back to its coop where it would go in and ring some little bell, and then, you know, the people that were watching it knew that a pigeon had come in and they could check. And by that time, this poor pigeon, I think one of his legs had been shot off. And
so he was a real warrior.
he was wounded terribly, but they nursed him back to health, and eventually he did recover. I don't know how long pigeons, you know, what their lifespan is, but when he died, they did stuff him and put him in the Smithsonian. So Jeremy is this very famous pigeon.
And do you know what the message was that he carried back? Send supplies, please?
They told him to stop the artillery barrage because they were hitting them.
Oh, the Americans were hitting the
Right,
Americans.
yeah, they didn't have the correct range, you know. They should have been shooting a little farther ahead. Anyway, they got the message from the bird, and they were able to correct it anyway. And eventually, they were rescued. The Lost Battalion was rescued, but they said when they first got into this situation when they were attacking, there was almost 700 men, and by the time they got rescued, they were down to, what was it, like 200 and some.
Oh, wow, so a tremendous loss.
Terrible. Terrible. And you read about it, you think, gosh, how could these guys have held out like that? But they did. They were really big heroes. And so if you hear about the Lost Battalion and Jeremy the pigeon, that's what it's all about. And on the same kind of a topic, you know, segue here, we do pigeons, are airplanes. And they really started to get used in World War I because you know when Orville and what's the other guy?
Wilbur.
Wilbur Wright had their first.
The Wright brothers.
Yeah, when they first had their flight.
It was, I want to say, like the 1890s, or was it later?
I looked it up. It was 1903.
Oh, okay.
So now here it is, less than 20 years later. And when the war started, airplanes were, well, they were pretty primitive. They were pretty much, you know, they had one seat, and they were biplanes, and they were usually made of canvas. And what they used them for in the Great War basically was reconnaissance, so they could get up there and see
who was where.
Yeah, right. And so, of course, the opposing side didn't like that, so they would come out, and that's when they would have their dog fights. You remember Snoopy?
Yes, the Red Baron.
Right, the Red Baron, who was a real person.
Yes, he was.
Manfred von Richthofen. He was the great German ace, and he was eventually killed, shot down, killed, and that would have been last, I don't know, May or April that he met his end, because they said these aviators had really short lifespans. Of course, they were very dashing, you know.
Yes. Well, they were all heroes in the rights of their own people.
And they were like the rock stars of the Great War, were these aviators. And when they first started, you know, using airplanes, if you had to fight off an enemy combatant, you pretty much had to have your pistol with you in the cockpit, and you were
shooting out the window
at each other. Right. But then they improved it so that they had a machine gun. They fixed it so it could fire between the revolutions of the propeller.
And that's quite a feat in physics.
It
because
is.
it's all timing and
yeah, it's
trajectory.
amazing
Yes.
that they could do that. But then once they got there, well, then they could get up there, and start shooting at each other like that. Sometimes the planes had two people in there, and so one could be, shooting and the other guy would be flying, and it was cold when they got up there, that was a problem. They were sitting out, there was no...
Out in the elements.
Right.
And the higher you go up in the air profile, the colder the temperature gets.
That's right. So it got pretty chilly. And so as it progressed, you hear of these dogfights and everything, the Germans and the British and the French pilots and then the American pilots. And by the end of the war, I think the planes were getting down to where they just were, a monoplane with one wing. But because of the war and the need to have these airplanes, they really got in there and improved them, and more inventions and everything. So the other thing, as far as dropping bombs, if you wanted to drop a bomb on somebody from an airplane, you went up there and you had your bomb and you dropped it out. Yeah.
Well, again, out the window.
Right.
We're throwing a lot of things out the window.
Right, they threw a lot of things out the window. And the American ace, the guy that was the most famous American pilot, was a guy called Eddie Rickenbacker. Have you ever heard of him?
Yes.
Okay. He was a pretty fantastic guy. He had been a race car driver prior to the war. Didn't know anything about airplanes, but he decided he didn't want to be in the infantry. He wanted to fly, and he became the American ace, the guy with the most confirmed kills. And he was one of these rubbery people. I mean,
Whereabout did he hail from?
I think it was Ohio, and he'd come up with a pretty, his father had died, but he was one of these rubbery people that if you drove over him with a truck, he just kind of snapped right back up. He had had all kinds of, accidents and things happen to him, and even after the war, I think he wound up getting shot down. This is in World War II, and was for 2 weeks on a raft out in the Pacific Ocean. So he died a natural death, and I think he was the founder of Eastern Airlines.
Wow, what a history.
But yeah, he's just one of those people, I just have to call him rubbery, because there was no way, apparently, to stop this guy.
9 lives.
Right, yeah.
Do you know
There
how
are
many
people.
confirmed kills he had?
26, I believe.
That's huge.
Yeah, well, considering he was only in the war for a short time.
Right.
Yeah. And this Manfred von Richthofen, his confirmed was 88.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he was quite the flyer.
That's why they called him the Red Baron.
That's why they called. He painted his plane red. That's why they called him the Red Baron. He was real cocky. He thought, I'm so good, I'm going to paint my plane bright red so everybody knows it's me. You come and get me, He was a pretty tough guy. But like I say, they were the rock stars of the war. People really, they were the ones that, had the silk scarves, but they didn't have a very long lifespan.
Now, of the 2 million that went to war, how many came home?
Boy, that would be an interesting number, just of the United States. There were, of course, a lot of casualties. And casualties means people that were wounded and killed. Gosh, it must have been close to 80,000 or more.
And that's almost half.
Well, it was a lot, because fighting meant that these infantry, they had to attack a German position. And as they were attacking, usually across open ground, they were being sprayed with machine gun fire. It was terrible. I mean, it was almost like guaranteed death or
Injury.
Yeah. So it was pretty amazing.
And I'm sure the field hospitals of the time, I mean, we look at how far medical technology has come today in the whole next century.
Right.
And how did they manage to even care for wounded soldiers?
Well, I think they made a lot of advances there. They tried to get them off the battlefield, and they'd get them into these little field hospitals. It was kind of like a triage. And then from there, they were usually able to send them back to hospitals behind the line. But besides getting wounded, they had a big problem with disease, of course. Lice carry, is it typhus?
Yes.
You can get typhus. And then they had the Spanish influenza that probably killed more people that way than in combat. I know in Trempealeau County, there was like 56 men that were killed or died in World War I, and most of them, 2/3 of them, died from disease.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah, it was either influenza or diphtheria or some other diseases that we don't get anymore.
Right,
Yeah.
because I'm sure because of conditions and level of sanitation, all those played a factor really in mortality.
And I think back then they were just starting to make the connection between germs and you know, getting a disease. They weren't really sure how it all happened. But I think they made a lot of advances because they had to. One of the things they always talk about are people that needed facial reconstruction because maybe they'd had a terrible disfiguring wound on their face, and so they were trying like plastic surgery, and that really advanced a lot after the Great War. It's a terrible thing, but you know, that was important.
Well, you had to, something has to drive the demand to do better.
Right.
And if you have hundreds of thousands of casualties that need something more than what you have in your toolbox,
Right.
then that will,
You get inventive.
yes, you
Yeah.
do.
And there was also a posting on Facebook about a French lady who was a sculptor, and she started making like little masks that men could tie on over their face if they had like were missing their cheek or their jaw. I mean, you know, so they could go out in public.
Yes.
Yeah.
And people wouldn't ostracize and
Well,
stare.
yeah, it was pretty bad. And out of this county, you know, we had 20-some people that were killed in action. The first one being Martin Erickson, who died at the Battle of Cantigny, which was one of the very first fights that the United States really got in as an American force. And then there was the huge battle, the Meuse-Argonne, which was taking place the end of September up to the armistice. And that was actually the biggest battle that the United States to date has ever been in. And it had a lot of casualties. Was it 26,000? It was bad conditions. It was raining. And even though the Germans knew they couldn't win, they were kind of holding on because they thought maybe the longer they held on, the better terms they could get if they went in and said, well, maybe, you know,
We're going to settle.
let's just cut this because we can't hold out any longer. So it was right up until the armistice that they were still, you know, shooting at each other. And I guess one thing quick before we close here I have to mention is the food, what they had to eat. The guys that were out in the infantry, they had these things called rolling kitchens that were usually pulled by horses or mules. And I guess you could make a fire there and then cook up, you know, a hot meal. But sometimes they didn't get up there for days, and so yeah, the guys would be eating tinned stuff. They called it iron rations, and the people that ate it did not have fond memories of it. But
Well, and we can talk more about that the next time we get together on the History Files.
you bet. So we want to thank everybody, and remember all those doughboys, because it's kind of gotten to be a forgotten war, but it really shouldn't be. And I think most people, if they look into their family history, they might find somebody back there that was involved in that war. So thank you, Mary. Now you can run out and collect your dung beetles.
See you next time.
Yep.